I will go ahead and call us to order. It is 6:32. Julie, if you could please roll call us in.
Yep. J.C. Herman.
I'm here.
Natalie Lee.
She will not be here tonight.
Okay.
And
Elaine.
I don't think anyone else in the committee is coming tonight.
Do you want me to keep going?
I think you can just mark that they're absent.
Okay.
Thank you. Can I please have a motion to hold the meeting by Zoom in light of the governor's COVID-19 proclamation?
Sure.
Okay.
I don't think it's technically a motion, but a determination that it's unfeasible to meet in person. So as president, my decision to move forward onto for the governor's declaration.
Because we don't have committee members here to vote anyway. Thank you. We will be holding by Zoom as per the governor's COVID-19 proclamation. Do we have any citizens here for citizen comment? Let me get the chat open. We do not. Let me make Aisha I'm sorry, it's been so long since I've been a host on Zoom. Aisha, can you remind me how I make you?
Go to participants.
Oh, yes, now I remember. Thank you. Hold on, that's not what I wanted. Sorry, my computer's slow. Give me just a moment. Here we go. Hold on, that's not working. How do I?
When you go to the list, there should be a drop down that says more and gives you some options of things to do. And it should give you an option to make me a host or co-host.
Perfect. Thank you so much. There you go.
Are you ready for me to start?
I am. Aisha, the floor is yours.
All right. I am going to share my screen. And our session today will be similar to session 1 as far as the experience with learning through discussion, video, teaching, and personal reflection. So I will ask that everyone just takes a moment now to get something to write with, because throughout the training, there will be moments where there will be questions and topics to reflect on. And one of the things that we do in the opening and the beginning of the training is to identify a concrete intention, what you want to walk away with, what you want to contribute. And we'll revisit that intention later on. So I'll give everyone just a moment to make sure that you have something to write with before we start. Okay. So just an overview, because we have some people who were not here for the first session. And I'll do this at the beginning of each of our learning sessions to give us an overview for what each of the 3 sessions will cover. Session 1, we reviewed the equity charter, talked about conflict management, and started to dive into key terms. We'll dive into terms today. We'll talk about an equity lens, bridging the connection between the rating committee and the board. And then session 3 will continue that sort of discussion and reflection, and then talk specifically about race and park spaces and the idea and concept of reimagining public spaces around the lines of social and economic inequity. Because there were some people who were not here for the first session, and because it's good practice to remind us of what we did before, I'll give a brief overview of what the first session covered. So we talked about establishing norms in order to aid in understanding how we agree to share the space and creating opportunities for trust and relationships, as well as open dialogue. We addressed how racial equity is an imperative and that it impacts all other isms if we focus on racial equity and how it benefits everyone in our society. We talked about the Ridgeville Charter and how it's a means to address equity issues in the RPD, the Ridgeville community, and to strengthen Ridgeville. We also talked about the concept of mindfulness and how that's used as a method to increase our self-awareness, to increase empathy, and our capacity to engage with others from an authentic place. We talked about racial equity as a process and an outcome. We talked about there being varied types of racism and how it's important to understand them and how they show up in our work, in our communities. And then also our capacity to build the skill of self-reflection and how that skill set is an important component of this work. Our agenda today, we're going to continue our deep dive. And again, these definitions that we're talking about and are available on the equity page for Ridgeville. We're going to be talking again about racism, implicit bias. We're going to talk about privilege. We're going to talk specifically about the concept of white privilege. We're going to talk about microaggressions. We're going to focus on the equity lens and then also bridging the connection between the Ready Committee and the board. I'm going to give a reminder of our norms. And our norms are the way that we are committing to show up in this space, committing to hold space for each other, and also how we're committed to honoring each other during this time that we have together. So our norms are to assume best intentions and also own our impact, to share from our own experience and perspectives, to not speak for others, not speak as a spokesperson, to expect and accept non-closure, to monitor our airtime and also land the plane when we're contributing to conversation, to be willing to ask questions, to respect and honor of levels of transparency that differs for everyone who's here tonight, and then also just be available to be an active participant. And what it means to be an active participant can differ, whether that means contributing to the verbal conversation, putting things in the chat, asking questions in the chat, or actively engaging in the reflection and reflective activities. Are there any questions about the norms before we move forward? All right. So before we jump into the content, we are going to have a moment for mindfulness. And mindfulness, again, is this concept and idea that is helps us to increase and heighten our awareness. It invites an opportunity for us to take a moment to engage and be aware of ourselves while we're connecting with others. And it's a skill set that we can use as we talk about moving forward and engaging in diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So I'd like everyone just to find a comfortable position. We're going to connect to ourselves and bring ourselves more present by connecting to our breath and being aware of our body in this moment. So find a comfortable position, and I will ask that your feet are planted on the floor. And you can either close your eyes or find a lowered point to focus on. If you just want to focus on either the image on the screen or the words on the screen, that's something that you can do as well. And I'd like you to place one hand on your chest and one hand on your belly. And you might notice the weight of your hand. You might notice the temperature. Your hands might be cool, they might be warm. You might notice your heart rate. You might notice the sensation of a rise and a fall of your chest, maybe an expansion and a collapse of your belly as you inhale and exhale. I'd like you to notice the weight of your body in your chair. Notice the sensation of that connection of your body to the seat beneath you. Allowing that chair, that seat to fully hold your weight, knowing that all you have to do in this moment is to think about your breath, connect to your body. And now I'd like you just to notice the sensation of your feet on the floor. If you're wearing socks, you might notice the sensation of your socks. If you're wearing shoes, you might notice the soles of your shoes. And then finally, I'd like you to notice the surface that your feet are planted on. Surface might be firm, there might be some softness if there's a rug or carpeting. And from this posture, I'd like you now to turn your attention and your focus to your breath. Not shifting, changing, or adjusting anything, just being aware of how you're breathing in this moment. Your breath may be deep, it may be shallow. Just being aware. And with that awareness, you may have noticed that your breath naturally begins to deepen. And if that happens, allow it to happen. And from this posture and position, we'll be taking a few breaths together as a collective. We'll be breathing in through our nose and breathing out through our mouth. So take a few cleansing breaths on your own. Now breathing in through your nose and releasing through your mouth. Breathing in through your nose and releasing through your mouth. Breathing in through your nose and releasing through your mouth. 2 more breaths that way, breathing in, breathing out. 1 more breath that way, breathing in and breathing out. I'd like you now just to continue that cycle of breath, finding a pace and a rhythm that feels comfortable for you. And as you breathe, just doing a quick scan of your body, noticing places where there might be stress or tension. And you might imagine breath visiting those places to act as a release. Turning our attention back to the placement of our hands, noticing the weight, the temperature of your palms connecting with your body. You might notice your heart rate. You might notice a rise and a fall in your chest, an expansion and collapse in your belly. Bringing your attention to your spine against the back of your chair. Finally, the weight of your body being held and supported by your seat. And one last time, noticing our feet planted on the ground. Might notice your socks, your shoes. Noticing the surface that your feet are resting on. Note if it's firm, if there's any softness. And when you feel ready, you can release your hands. Notice that shift in your body. And if your eyes were closed, I'll invite you to slowly blink your eyes open. You'll notice light, colors, shapes. You'll notice the screen in front of you. And I'd like you to take a moment to give your body what it needs. You might need to yawn, you might need to stretch, you might need to just adjust your posture or positioning. And as we give our body what it needs, I'd like you to consider your intention for our session today. And with focusing on these two questions, what do I hope to gain in this session? And what do I hope to give? So again, thinking about, we'll be focusing again on the definitions that we have. We'll be talking about a racial equity lens. What do I hope to gain and what do I hope to give? So I'll give a few minutes to reflect on this. Taking about 30 more seconds. Okay. So we will be continuing on the journey that we started last week with talking about the definitions, the common language, the common ground that we'll start from with understanding this approach and thinking about racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. So we'll start again today. We're looking at racism. We'll pick up where we left off. And structural racism is our first concept. Can someone read this definition from the screen?
I can read. Structural racism, discriminatory practices, principles, cultural values, and ways of life that have been ingrained in a society and perpetuate racism and discrimination.
Okay. And now systemic racism. Can someone read this definition?
Systemic racism, discrimination that is perpetuated within a system that was established and reinforced by practices and principles rooted in racism.
Thank you. So structural racism and systemic racism are here combined on this same slide. Structural racism is included in systemic racism. Oftentimes when you see a definition, it will be just connected to systemic racism because structural racism is included in that. So we're going to be talking and doing a little bit of a deeper dive and thinking about systemic racism. which is a form of racism that is embedded in the laws and regulations of a society or an organization. And when we think about systemic racism, we can think about that it perpetuates and supports the widespread unfair treatment and oppression of people of color. And systemic racism is pervasive. What I like about this quote is that it gives us a way to reflect on how pervasive it is, that systemic racism is so embedded in systems that it often is assumed to reflect the natural and inevitable order of things. Any reactions or responses to this definition? And feel free to either use the chat, you can unmute yourself as well if you want to share verbally.
I would like to share that the definition is absolutely true. I mean, it's assumed to reflect the natural, inevitable order of things. Sometimes we don't even notice. I mean, it's just there. It's been there, and that's one of my gains tonight, is to further understand systemic racism.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Any other reactions or responses?
Oh, sorry, Matt, go ahead.
I've been reflecting kind of since last week, and I've been reading a real great book that kind of interconnects Sapiens, a brief history of humankind. Mm-hmm. And the author kind of puts forth the concept that there's objectivity, subjectivity, and then intersubjectivity, and that intersubjectivity is kind of the cultural norms. Kind of, it seems like it gets to the systemic racism mm-hmm. concept of that it laws and culture, like it's not objective, it's not natural law, it's not physics, but as kind of culture morphs, these things just get embedded and seem to be immovable.
Thank you for that. JC, you were going to say something?
Well, one of the things I wanted to say is I think this is part of the reason why this can be a difficult conversation to be had with some people, depending on your life experiences. If you don't have experience with people who are in marginalized communities, you won't necessarily see the damage that this does. And thus opening up the conversation of why things need to change becomes more difficult. The other thing that I wanted to add too is this idea of, in some spaces and some, from my experience in some schools, there's this idea of, well, we're going to be equal by not acknowledging like holidays and differences and that sort of stuff. But then what ends up bubbling to the surface is what the dominant culture is. Like you can't erase culture. And I think that in an attempt to not do this, sometimes we emphasize this because we're not consciously looking at all those differences and enjoying all those differences. And by not doing that, we're just letting that dominant culture be what's out there as like the default.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I think that also connects to what Matt was talking about of how we're creating these structures and systems, and how much all of this is connected to the culture of a particular society. And Natalie, you were hitting on too, that it's difficult to address some of these things too, because of that it becomes the natural way of being. And so sometimes it's hard to see something that feels like it's natural, or the way that it should be, or the way that things have always been. And so what I would say is that when we start to use the term of this is just the way that it's always been, that's likely an opportunity for us to do a little bit of investigation of where does that come from, who is the decision maker, and does that work for where we are now? The other thing that I'll say just as a reminder, as we are talking about race and race inequity, and there are other isms, and a lot of the concepts that we're talking about when we look at the other isms, so classism, sexism, heterosexism, homophobia there, ableism, that some of these structures and process and ways of being operate really similarly in our society when we look at the other isms as well. So that's also important to keep in mind as we move forward. Something that is also important for us to talk about, and we won't spend much time here because this is a larger topic for another day when we're talking about trauma, but it is important to touch on and identify and know that there is a connection between racism and trauma. Can someone read that first quote here on the screen?
I can. Racism and trauma. Racial trauma, or race-based traumatic stress, RBTS, refers to the mental and emotional injury caused by encounters with racial bias and ethnic discrimination, racism, and hate crimes.
Thank you for that. So there's lots of different ways that the trauma of racism can impact communities and be expressed. One of those ways is vicarious trauma, which is the indirect experiencing. So there's the direct experience of the person being on the receiving end of the trauma. And then there are other ways that are ways that we typically probably don't think about when we think about trauma. So vicarious trauma is indirect experiencing. An example of that can be witnessing either in person or via media, whether that's social media or the actual media. An example of that are the police killings that we all experienced. Intergenerational transmission of stressors as well is something that's important for us to be aware of. So the impact of things like slavery, the Holocaust, Native mass killings, and violent removals from land. Those things are the stressors of those events are passed down through generations. So intergenerational trauma is trauma, again, that is passed down from generation to generation. And I think one of the things to think about is this quote. So when we think about trauma being passed down, it's not necessarily that it's the specific event, but what it does is causes a level of sensitivity in the next generation. And this quote here talks about how it's not that the fear is being passed down to the generation, it's that the fear in one generation leads to a sensitivity in the next generation. Any reactions or responses to these ideas and concepts of the connection of racism and trauma and the ideas of trauma being passed down, or the impacts and effects of trauma, specifically race-based trauma that is passed down from generation to generation?
I'm not, this idea of intergenerational trauma is not new to me, but this concept of, it's not the fear, it's the sensitivity, right? Like when you grow up hearing stories of what the previous generation went through, it makes you much more aware of not only the residual impact that still exists, but it also it has odd effects. The example that I can speak to is I have several friends whose grandparents were in the Holocaust, And my father was very food insecure growing up. And one of the things that we have in common is this really a lot of attention being paid to food and making sure that there's enough food either in the house or packed throughout the day, which is something I hadn't really noticed until starting to have some of these, having some of these conversations, in groups like these. That sensitivity and that awareness. I've never in my life been without food, but it is something I'm very, very aware of, both in my habits and in the things that I would like to help other people with.
Thank you for
It's
sharing.
interesting. I think it makes a lot of sense.
I think that's a perfect example of that heightened sensitivity that's passed down to a future generation that didn't directly experience the trauma, but experiences some of the residual impacts and effects of a generation before it actually experiencing the trauma. Thank you for that. Any other reactions or responses to either this idea or the connection between racism and trauma? I'm going to keep us moving. Our next term is white privilege. And before we dive into the concept of white privilege, we're going to talk about privilege itself. Can someone read this definition?
White privilege. Privilege, a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group to accord a higher value or superior position to.
So the first one is a definition, and then the second one is the verb of privilege, which is it's the action of according a higher value or superior position to something, someone, a person or a group. And when we think of white, so to go back, so privilege is something that, dependent on where you are, circumstances, privilege is something that we all possibly have access to or experience in some way, form, or fashion. So when we talk about white privilege, and I'm going to read the definition, it's societal privileges that benefit white people over people of color that include greater access to power and resources than people of color. It is not racist to have white privilege and recognize its existence. White people did not earn disproportionate access. White privilege exists because of historic and enduring racism and bias in our society. Reactions or responses to this definition?
My reaction or response is, I don't fully understand it. And I know for a fact, a lot of white people don't fully understand it and perceive it to be a negative, not a basically just a definition. They perceive it to be a negative when the term comes up. Like it's their fault.
I think this is one of those areas where addressing or thinking about and talking about this topic can cause a heightened level of sensitivity. But it's important for us to look at it, to talk about it, to know what it is and know how it operates and impacts functioning of the society that we all are members of. So thank you for sharing that. Matt Mitchell, were you gonna, I think you unmuted.
I was just gonna jump in. I think, kind of adding to what Brian said, is in a white dominant, white privileged society, white privilege is the norm. And so those in the privileged class don't necessarily experience the privilege. They just experience life, and I think like a good example is like a police stop or a police encounter or an encounter in a retail store where a Black person or folks of color could experience that differently. And because the dominant white folks never experienced that without the privilege, it's hard to see.
Thank you for sharing that. It's sort of similar to what JC was saying earlier about, and the definition earlier about how some things just become a norm, which makes it difficult to see. So yes, if it is something that you, it's not something you had to work for, you were just born into, it could be difficult to recognize and see until you interact with situations or things in society to sort of wake you up to the reality of that existence or to see that as a privilege. Other reactions or responses?
I just wanted to add real fast. I attended a diversity speak that Biz Lindsay Ryan, who she's on the school board in District 65, and she is also a professor, I believe, at DePaul or Loyola. I can't remember. But I felt her analogy, I think, made a lot of sense to people of we don't notice when we're on a path somewhere, we don't notice when the doors are open to us. We just keep moving across that path. We do notice when those doors are closed, right? So when those of us who experience white privilege, when we are moving down a path and we're not coming across challenges, we're not being told that we can't participate, we're not lacking the resources that we need to move forward, you're not necessarily going to know that. You're not going to notice it because you're just going to keep moving along your path. Whereas if you get to a certain point where you're trying to get in college and you either don't have the money or the high school that you came from did not prepare you for that level of academia, you're going to notice those doors that are making your path difficult. And I felt like that was a good analogy.
Thank you for sharing that. Okay. So we're going to listen to someone talking about this idea of privilege connected to social justice. I will say this video is from 2012. So you'll notice that, but it is still relevant. So that's a little bit of time has passed since 2012, but it's still relevant. And Peggy McIntosh, if you don't know who she is a anti-racist activist, educator, and talks and writes a lot about privilege, social justice, and white privilege specifically. So we're going to take a few moments and listen to Peggy McIntosh. What I want you to do while you're listening is to think about the things that stick with you from what she says, what she shares, and then we'll come back to those things when we at the end of her. Can you hear this? Okay.
I imagine a hypothetical line of social justice, a hypothetical line, an imaginary line of social justice that is parallel to the floor, also parallel to the earth. And on this imaginary line of social justice, things feel fair. Below it, one can be pushed down either as a member of a group or an individual through bullying, teasing, being stereotyped, having prejudices against one or one's group, being a survivor of genocide, being a scapegoat, being a discarded person. What I study is what happens above the hypothetical line of social justice. And in school, I was never taught to even notice this realm. Above the hypothetical line, one can be pushed up, believed, thought worthy of responsibility, considered to be responsible with money, considered to be capable of doing the schoolwork or any other kind of work. One can be seen as representative of the best. That's privilege. Above the hypothetical line of justice, one has more than one deserved because of circumstances of birth and other people's positive projections onto one. And below it is disadvantage. That is unearned disadvantage. And I believe everybody in this room has a combination of both experiences. Having more than we actually earned and having less than we actually earned. And I didn't used to think this way. I was raised, as many of you have been, on the myth of meritocracy, which is the unit of society is the individual, and whatever the individual ends up with at death is what that individual worked for and earned and deserved and wanted. Well, it isn't true. These privileged systems which locate us above and below the hypothetical line of social justice were invented, and we were born into them. And we all know both sides, and that's a reason for compassion about the sadness of having been born into systems that gave us such, and here I quote the poet Adrienne Rich, such different politics of location. I came to notice privilege because I noticed male privilege, and then I noticed in parallel fashion white privilege, and both of these things were very distressing. I hated learning about privileged systems, but I found I had to explain my life.
Any reactions or responses? What stuck with you from what you just heard from Peggy McIntosh? And you can either unmute, you can use the chat, or you can use your the paper that you're using to write and reflect. What stuck with you?
I think it's interesting how she noted that everybody's a combination of the two. That depending upon situations, you may be the person in privilege, but you also might be the person who's not in privilege in a totally different situation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that.
I agree 100% with what Matt said. And unfortunately, the school I went to did exactly that. It made you feel privileged, and it also made you feel disadvantaged in a variety of ways. Great school.
Thank you for sharing. Other thoughts or reflections or things that stuck with you from what you just heard?
I think that last piece of what she said, which is something that I hope and believe that all people can do is, once you see that someone else has privilege in an area that you don't, that it helps to spread your understanding of where you do have privilege and others don't. Right? Like I feel like those experiences hopefully are parallel for as many people as possible, because I feel like that's really where growth happens in terms of being able to be compassionate and reflect on how we got where we are in terms of race in this country.
Thank you for that, Chasey. Yeah, and I think overall where the direction that she was going is how increasing our capacity for understanding this concept of privilege and how it operates in our society and impacts different members of our society. It's a way for us to be building on compassion and empathy for ourselves, for each other, and gives us a way really to investigate how we exist and the why of it from a place of compassion and empathy as well. At the end of the clip, she shared a quote, which was about positionality. And she talked about that too, when she talked about being above and below aligned, and how looking at positionality in our society is a way for understanding how power, and this is similar to what Matt was sharing, how power and privilege can shows up, and we have access to those in different times, and how that understanding of power and privilege affects our perspectives as well. Other thoughts about what you just heard, or things that stuck with you?
I thought it was interesting how she made the connection of recognizing racial privilege from being on the opposite side of male privilege.
Mm-hmm.
So she recognized that in one area of her life, she was in the unprivileged department, and in another,
Mm-hmm.
the privileged.
Yeah,
I
and
feel like that's kind of visceral.
Yeah, and that brings us back to one of the concepts that we were talking about last week with intersectionality, and how when you're at the intersection of different types of identities, that impacts that positionality, and it impacts the experience of power and privilege in the society that we exist in. And part of the reason that we start with race when we're talking about racial equity is because of, at that intersection of race in the society that we exist in, we see differences in resource access, power, and privileges in our society. So this quote pretty much sums up much of what everyone has shared thus far. Can someone volunteer? It is a lengthy quote, but important to the conversation and discussion. Can someone volunteer to read this quote?
White privilege. Privilege, particularly white or male privilege, is hard to see for those of us who were born with access to power and resources. It is very visible for those to whom privilege was not granted. Furthermore, the subject is extremely difficult to talk about because many white people don't feel powerful, or as if they have privileges others do not. It is sort of like asking fish to notice water or birds to discuss air. For those who have privileges based on race or gender or class or physical ability or sexual orientation or age, it just is. It's normal.
Any thoughts or reflections? This pretty much, like I said before, sums up much of what everyone has been contributing to the discussion and conversation before. But any reactions or responses just seeing it written in that way?
I mean, I'll just say at the very end, when they talk about sexual orientation as a gay man, that speaks to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to go through this all the time with people asking, well, when did you choose to be gay? To which my response was, when did you choose to be straight?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's very much, it's like, this is what it is. And it's not something that's chosen. And if you didn't make the choice on your end, how did I make the choice on my end?
Thank you for sharing. Other reactions or responses?
I think the quote sums up white privilege almost perfectly. And when I get into my conversations with some of my white friends who discuss white privilege and how they don't understand it, and I don't understand it, I should have this quote in my pocket and read it, because the one line that struck me was, it's hard to see for those of us who were born with the access to power and resources. I was not born into power and resources. So therefore, I thought I was not white privileged. I know many, many people who were born into power and resources, and they completely don't understand white privilege, because with power and resources, they still had to, go to great colleges, get grades, had the resources to get masters and things of that. Great jobs opened the doors, were opened through their resources and their power. It doesn't always work for many white people that way, but I think, again, this whole definition sums it up very, very well written.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think in that instance, it's useful too to think about white privilege as institutional privilege. Sometimes when we think from the perspective of individual, it's especially when individuals are born into circumstances where they are not privileged as far as either class or physical ability, but there is a privilege element to their identity in their race that it's difficult to see where and how privilege shows up. JC, I think you were going to say something.
I think it's one of the things that makes this conversation hard to have is that there seems to be a misunderstanding that those of us who experience white privilege, that it somehow means that we don't struggle or we don't work hard. I think that's the piece that people have a hard time teasing out, especially, when talking about, underprivileged white people. I think it's a really difficult conversation to have, because white privilege doesn't mean that you don't still have to work hard to get somewhere. It just makes it's much more likely that with your hard work, you'll be able to get where you want to go. Because of people of color, it's not necessarily about how hard you work, it's about who's willing to give you the opportunity to do that work in the first place.
Thanks, JC. Other reactions, reactions or responses. So we're going to continue down this road a little bit, and we're going to do a modified privilege walk. People have likely experienced a privilege walk before, and this aligns with the conversation that we're having around our capacity and ability to witness or see and identify things that are privilege. And so I'm going to ask that everyone take out something that you can write with. I'll be asking you a series of questions. And for each question, you will either give yourself a check mark or a tick mark on your page, or you'll take one away. So take a moment, make sure you have something to write with. And I will say, with privilege walks, one of the things to also be aware or mindful of is the perspective of what is considered a privilege as well. Okay, so if either of your parents graduated from college, write a check mark on your page. If English is your first language, write a check mark. If you have been divorced or impacted by divorce, take away one check mark. If there have been times in your life when you skipped a meal because there was no food in the house, take away a check mark. If you have a visible or invisible disability, take away a check mark. If you were encouraged to attend college by your parents and family members, give yourself a check mark. If you grew up in an urban setting, take away a check mark. If your family had health insurance, give yourself a check mark. If your work and school holidays coincide with religious holidays that you celebrate, give yourself a check mark. That one was kind of long, I'll repeat it. If your work and school holidays coincide with religious holidays that you celebrate, give yourself a check mark. If you studied the culture or the history of your ancestors in elementary school, give yourself a check mark. If you have been bullied or made fun of based on something you cannot change, like your gender, ethnicity, age, sexual orientation, take away a check mark. If you have ever felt passed over for an employment position based on your gender, ethnicity, age, or sexual orientation, take away a check mark. If you were ever offered a job because of your association with a friend or family member, give yourself a check mark. If you were ever stopped or questioned by the police because they felt you were suspicious, take away a check mark. If you or your family ever inherited money or property, give yourself a check mark. If you came from a supportive family environment, give yourself a check mark. If one of your parents was ever laid off or unemployed, not by choice, take away a check mark. If you are a citizen of the United States, give yourself a check mark. This one's going to be a long one too, so I'll repeat it. I'll say it twice. If you were ever uncomfortable about a joke or a statement you overheard related to your race, ethnicity, gender, appearance, or sexual orientation, but felt unsafe to confront the situation, take away a check mark. I'm going to repeat that one because it was long. If you were ever uncomfortable about a joke or a statement you overheard related to your race, ethnicity, gender, appearance, or sexual orientation, but felt unsafe to confront the situation, take away a check mark. If your ancestors were forced to come to the United States not by choice, take away a check mark. If you took out loans for your education, take away a check mark. If there were more than 50 books in your house growing up, give yourself a check mark. If you have ever felt unsafe walking alone at night, take away a check mark. So take a moment just to view your page. To reflect on some of the questions that were asked. And I'll invite anyone who desires to share what that experience was like.
enlightening.
Thank you. With
I think
these,
one thing that sort of was interesting to me is there was the comment about studying your ancestors, which obviously as a white male, I get where that's kind of going. But the thing that also I thought about was I grew up in Ohio and we were taught Ohio history, which involves a lot of Native Americans. And I have Native American way back in the family, nothing recent. But it's kind of interesting that to think that some cultures, even though they're marginalized cultures, because of the distance of time, can be taught a little more safely than other cultures can. It was okay to learn about the Native Americans because they don't exist in Ohio that much anymore. You know, I mean, they've kind of been shoved out over the years, and so it's a distant memory that we can learn safely about.
thank you for sharing that. So the perception of how safe a subject matter can also impact that privilege of being able to learn about different groups in our society. Other reactions, responses from this experience?
What's it say if you have a lot of check marks? And what's it say if you don't? Anything?
Well, what are your thoughts? What do you think if you ended up with, and what are some of the thoughts about the things that you were able to check off, check mark?
I will be very honest with you. I was left with only 2 check marks after some takeaways. But the takeaways make you think, parents, no college. Do you have a disability? Live in an urban setting? Have you ever been uncomfortable? A lot of people, I think, here would probably have felt uncomfortable at some point in time about a joke or where they were walking, whether they were of color or not. So, I mean, I was left with 2 positives. So,
how was that experience of taking away? If you had a check mark and then you had to take it away, and perhaps it was okay.
What's that?
I said perhaps there's the chance that was okay for you.
Yeah, well, it was some of the stuff I'm proud of. I didn't grow up with a silver spoon, but I love the way I grew up. So some of the stuff I was proud to take the check mark away.
Thank you for sharing.
Can I throw in there real fast? I mean, I know I always, bring things back to child development and kids, but that's just, where my brain is. When we talk about child development, we talk about risk and protective factors. And there's like an official list. And, if you really go through them, and the connection that I see here is, I very much understand how, having divorce impact your family can be something that takes your check away. But I also, it can sometimes be something that adds a check, right? Like if it is rectifying an unhealthy situation. So I think I don't think there was anything else on the list that I felt fell in this category of like, it really kind of depends what the situation was, whether it's going to take away your check or add one.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to move us forward into talking about and looking at bias. So I'll give you a moment just to, I know there's a lot of colors on your screen, to take in this image in front of you. Some of these may be types of bias that are sort of easy to figure out what it means. Some of them may not be. I'll go through a few definitions. Confirmation bias might be one that's less familiar. And that is the tendency, to process information by looking for or interpreting information consistent with one's own beliefs. So the tendency towards choosing things that confirm what you already believe to be true. There is the halo effect, which might not be as familiar. And that's a cognitive bias that is positive impressions of people, brands, products in one area positively influence feelings in another area. So our perception is positively influenced by our opinions of, let's say, a person, of that person's other related traits. So it's the idea that something, a brand, a person, a product, a group of people can do no wrong. An example of that could be if you have perceptions around prestigious learning institutions. And so the idea that because someone attended this institution and then you see them in another space, there's the idea that they have this halo. They can do no wrong because they're associated with this institution that you hold in really high regard. The conformity bias, which is right next to halo effect, that's our tendency to take cues for proper behavior from the actions of others. So this is sort of the don't rock the boat bias. So rather than using our own independent judgment, we are taking cues from those around us as to what is the quote unquote proper behavior and proper way to act. Beauty bias in that same line is people are perceived as a result of their levels of physical attractiveness. Name bias, can anyone guess what that might be about?
I would guess that's using names like Aisha and implying that that is a person of a certain race. Not a lot of white Aishas out there probably, but there are some. But when you hear that name, automatically assigning a race to it.
Thank you for that. Yes. So we're going to talk about implicit bias. We're also going to talk a little bit about affinity bias because those are things that come up in groups with people who work together. Can someone read this first quote? Someone?
Implicit.
Anyone.
I was starting. I heard someone else starting. Implicit bias is a form of bias that occurs automatically and unintentionally that nevertheless affects judgments, decisions, and behaviors.
Can someone read that next line?
Sorry, my mouse got stuck. The implicit associations we hold may not necessarily align with our declared beliefs or even reflect stances we would explicitly endorse.
Okay. Any just general reactions from those two things before we talk about favoring our in group? Okay. So when we think about implicit bias, we also hold biases that generally favor the group that we are a part of, although it's not impossible. And there are some times when we can still hold bias against our own group that we're a part of. One of the things that's important about implicit bias, so going back to this definition, is they're automatic, they can be unintentional, and they have this capacity to affect our judgment, our decisions, our behavior. That's important to know, that this is something that happens pretty quickly, many times unintentionally, and it impacts us in these very concrete and specific ways. Implicit biases are also malleable. So our brains are complex. And so just as some of these things are connected to things that we've learned through our experiences and what we've been exposed to in our society, we can also unlearn some of these things. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways that we can mitigate, and that's through awareness. And so we opened up with mindfulness, which is a way to heighten our sensitivity to ourselves, heighten our sensitivity to what am I thinking right now? What am I feeling? How is my body? Where is my body? And so thinking about fostering a practice of mindfulness, that's why those types of practices can help us in these types of situations. So, and impacting things like implicit bias. And then also using strategies to reduce our bias. So some of those strategies include thinking of counter stereotype examples. So when you're in a situation and a stereotype automatically pops into mind, a strategy that you can use to impact that implicit bias is to actively think of the opposite or something that discredits that stereotype. Perspective taking. Making attempts to view things from a perspective outside of your own and make an attempt to view things from the perspective of the person, the group that you have this bias towards. Interrupting automated bias thoughts. So this is a step-by-step process. The first is that we have to be aware of our biases. We have to be aware of our capacity to hold them and be aware of the ways in which they happen, that some things might be automatic, and that's a possibility for us. We have to pay attention to triggers, things that are people, places, and situations that bring up things that we hold that are biased thinking. We have to place ourselves in situations where we can encounter opportunities to challenge this automated thinking. And some of those ways is by interacting with difference, interacting with things that are people, places that are outside of what we consider that norm, the normal, quote unquote, normal way of being, to challenge and give us something to counter some of the stereotypic thoughts and the biases that arise. And then education. So part of what you're doing today is helping in this area. And then also doing your own research. So learning about other cultures, learning about others. And one of the things that I do want to say that's important is that it is good and great and wonderful to seek out information from people of marginalized groups. And we don't want that to solely be the only source that you use for information to learn about difference in others. Any reactions, responses, or thoughts about implicit bias? Affinity bias, I included this here because affinity bias is something that happens pretty often in work settings or in groups of people who work together. And affinity bias is something, it's how we subconsciously gravitate towards people that we believe have our shared interests, beliefs, and backgrounds. So, and this, again, there are positives, there can be benefits to affinity bias, and then there's also risks that are related to affinity bias. And when we look in a workplace, hiring for the idea of cultural fit is one of those areas where affinity bias can show up. And so it's important in those types of processes, or when we look around a room and we're talking about this idea, a concept of cultural fit, or when we're identifying that someone doesn't necessarily fit in with the culture, that we're taking note of those things. And we're differentiating between concrete skills, experiences, and unique qualities so that people are a culture add versus a culture fit. Any reactions, responses, or thoughts connected to this idea of affinity bias? We're going to take a moment to do a personal reflection. So I'd like you to take out what you've been using to write with. And again, when we do these personal reflections, afterwards, there is the opportunity to discuss and share if you would desire to, as much as you would desire to. And it's also okay to keep your reflection to yourself if you desire. So the questions that I want you to take a moment here to reflect on are, now that we've talked about bias, looked at bias, are there ways that bias shows up in your role at Ridgefield? Are there measures that are in place to impact bias? And then this final question of what would be useful to impact bias at Ridgefield? So take a few moments. Take one more minute. Right now, your final thoughts. Would anyone like to share? So again, this is a moment where your personal reflection can be just that, your personal reflection, or there's an opportunity here if you would like to share either about the process of thinking about these questions or specific questions that are on the screen.
in working with kids at Ridgeville, pre-COVID, a lot of the counselors had gone through the program and I was the newbie. And so, I came in, I was meeting some of the kids, and I oftentimes found myself surprised, and I'd, go to a counselor that knew the kids better than I did. Like, oh, I had no idea. Like, have you seen so-and-so draw? Like, they're usually out on the basketball court, and they're like, yeah, you didn't know, right? I inadvertently, when I would meet kids, whatever dominant part of their personality that they would show, I would, kind of put them in that box, so to speak. And then I would be so surprised when, another part of their personality would come out. And one of the things that I do as a teacher to try to check myself in that is, really trying to remember that the attitudes and opinions that I have about kids, I try to make a point of watching their behavior and seeing if their behavior actually fits into the model that I have created for them or not. And sometimes it really does. And sometimes I'm like, totally flabbergasted and surprised that I either didn't see it coming or was something that I didn't notice. I pride myself on being a pretty observant person. And so at Ridgeville, one of the things that I found to be really helpful in that is having the kind of relationship with the other people that I'm working with, so that we can have these conversations, so that people know, what information we need to share with each other, so we can make sure we all know the kids really well. I'm not the director of the art camp anymore, but in the time that I spent there last year, that's something that still is really happening, where I am there and I hear these discussions being had of, different, either skills that kids have, or, maybe a kid that seems super confident and somebody realizes like, oh, he's actually anxious and, trying to play it off. So those are some of the ways that I've seen this play out in my work at Ridgeville. Sorry, that was so long.
Oh, no, it was just fine. Thank you, Jaycee. Others who want to share or contribute? One of the ways that bias can be expressed is through microaggressions. And so this is one of those other words, definitions, and also experiences that it's important for us to have an awareness of as we're interacting with each other. So microaggressions are, I'm going to read the definition, are defined as a statement, action, or incident regarded as an instance of indirect, subtle, intentional, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group, such as a racial or ethnic minority. So we're going to listen to experiences of people talking about what they believe microaggressions are. And we watched a video. This is from the Seattle Times Project. And it's a group of people just, again, reacting to this question of what does microaggressions mean to you? So as you listen, there may be some things that you agree with. There may be some things that you disagree with. There may be some things that you strongly disagree with. One of this activity is opening up our sensitivity to hear other people's experiences and hear other people's perspective. Let me know if you cannot hear this video.
Just seems like something The Onion came up with. Just putting the word micro in front of aggression, because it's not a big aggression, it's just a micro one.
Microaggression is supposed to be small, seemingly innocent, sometimes unintentional, naive or ignorant interactions.
The things that are done unintentionally that can be viewed as derogatory, pejorative.
I think microaggressions are bullshit. I'm sorry, I'm trying not to curse, but that is just, it's just too much of, just over explaining your ignorance. Microaggressions, I don't think, when you're receiving it, they're not micro. I think it's easier for the person who was doing it to use that term.
Microaggressions to me are sort of like those small little actions or comments that communicate to people that they're less than or aren't worthy.
One of my Black students, she often gets approached and told that she's very articulate. And so there's a microaggression there because it comes from people who just, unknown to them, automatically assume that a lot of Black people are not very articulate.
You're so smart, you're so eloquent. And I feel like the piece that they're leaving off is like, despite that, you're a woman of color. Oh, you're standing out from this group of people that I had previously thought something else of.
It's like when people tell me that I don't act like a regular Black person.
Oh, you look like you came out of the African gallery. As beautiful as, my ancestry and my culture is. And good for you working here. Good for you. A lot of that.
They may not feel like much individually, but they add up. And to me, they are little fractures that spotlight racism. We see that you do think another is inferior or that you are superior.
It's traumatizing. And it's also just kind of a constant reminder that the world you walk in and you live in wasn't made for you and isn't always safe for you.
It makes me feel like I don't belong in the country that I was born in. Microaggressions to me are asking, wouldn't I like to let my hair down just once? Or wouldn't I like to wear a swimsuit on a beach just once? I'm suddenly reminded that I'm not seen for my character or for my actions or for how good I am as a person. Rather, I'm just seen for the headscarf that's on my head.
I say, oh, I can definitely see that you may be Asian because I can tell by your eyes. Is that a microaggression?
You think you're giving a compliment, but you're really not. It's like, oh, you're so exotic looking.
Like when a guy will tell me that I'm pretty, and then he'll say like, oh, so what are you mixed with? And I'm like, I'm Black. That's a microaggression. Like they're basically trying to tell you that just being pure Black, you can't be beautiful. You have to be mixed with something.
People ask me all the time, like, what nationality are you? I'm like, well, my mom is Syrian and Czechoslovakian, and my dad was Haitian, and I think that's friggin' cool. What if people are just like being curious?
People ask us if, we do speak English, or they'll kind of talk slowly and try to make sense of the words we're saying, or it's as if they're trying to process the fact that we actually are speaking fluent English. This is my first language.
When we think of the word aggressive, I think that is, deliberate to make it seem like it's a little bit more than offensive, like it's almost a physical attack. Almost like they're touching you.
When I was at SPU, I used to have an afro. Kids would come up behind me and touch my hair. Like, no permission, I don't know them. Come up behind me and touch my hair. And I turn around and slap their hand away and like, what are you doing? I'm like, oh, it's just so soft. It just looks so soft, I just want to touch it. Look it, let me come up behind a white girl and start touching her hair. I'm locked up with the quickness.
Some people might see that as like nice, but I really don't. I feel like that's like kind of offensive to like ask somebody, can you touch their hair? Like if their hair's in a style that you're not used to.
It's this weird, like fetish weird thing that white people have with our hair. That's absolutely, I don't know what it is.
A couple years ago during Halloween was parking my car in a garage in downtown, and this older white gentleman saw me get out of my car, and he's very, very social, and he asked me what they call Halloween in my country. And I told him, well, they call it Halloween because this is my country. To be honest, I cared less about how he felt about being the microaggressor and more about how it made me feel. It's about the impact and not about the intent of the person who engaged in that behavior.
We've gone really far in saying it's all about what the person receiving it thinks that it means.
I also think it has to do with like people just not really having like a backbone. And I think we've become this society where these like kids are these like delicate orchids that just wilt once they leave the greenhouse, like they just die.
I'd rather for them to just call me a nigger, because it would have been easier to take. It's easier to take just, the overt, just racial slurs than the way people try to dress it up as not being a racial exchange at all.
I don't know. It just seems ridiculous. And there's just like so many things to remember now that you're not supposed to say, you can't do, you can't think it.
The people who commit the microaggression are like, do you mean I have to think about every little thing I say and do? It feels very painful. It feels very tedious to do that. And my response to that is yes, for you now, finally in your adult life, to experience this effort. It's about time, because the people that you have done this microaggression to have experienced it all their lives.
People who are hostile to the notion of microaggressions assume that games are being played, assume that this is actually driven by specific political agendas. It's the victim card. I think people don't understand that there's actually pain there. I'm really split on the issue of microaggressions, because I don't want to deny anyone's pain, but I also can't imagine a world where interacting with difference is done without pain.
Okay. Thoughts and reactions after viewing that video. Is there anything that stuck with you from listening to those varied perspectives on this idea around microaggressions? And some were also speaking to their experience of being on the receiving end.
I think this is the hardest part of all of this, because I think there's a lot of, if you'll pardon the expression, there's a lot of gray area. It's not black and white on everything. And so I can understand where calling someone who's Black articulate or well-spoken or something like that can be offensive at a level. But I also use that terminology with a white person maybe, and that's not the offense. And I'm using it maybe in the exact same way. And so that's where it gets into this whole really gray area, because you have two people who are trying to read each other's minds, and that doesn't work well. I think the last guy said it really well. There's going to be pain because you just don't know how things are. It can be the most innocent of comments made. And I mean, some of the comments there in some of the situations were egregious in my opinion. Others, they kind of head into that very gray area where, maybe you're reading into it as the recipient differently than it was intended, or maybe the person giving the comment is actually wanting to say more, but doesn't feel polite society lets them say anything differently.
Thank you for sharing that. There's a lot of dynamics that are at play, where someone on the receiving end of a microaggression, the intention of the person may be to offer something that they view as uplifting, and they may be encountering someone who has experienced microaggressions on a regular basis, and so their sensitivity is heightened, and so the interaction shifts because of their experience and what they're tying that situation to. And you shared about reading each other's minds, and here is where those human interactions, and that's the place where the humanity has an opportunity to step in, to have conversation, if there's the capacity to around that type of interaction. Thank you for sharing that. Matt Mitchell, I think you unmuted.
I did. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I guess I thought it was interesting how a number of people made the connection of, well, what's the difference between an aggression and a microaggression? And then also intent versus impact. I don't have a whole lot else to add, but I mean, I guess maybe is the difference between a microaggression and an aggression intent, or is a microaggression just like a dominant, culturally accepted way of, I don't know, exerting power?
It's a good question that you're posing. And I think this is one of those concepts where we're all grappling with this experience, because no one is immune from being on the receiving end of microaggressions, because there's intersectionality. So there's something in your identity that you may then be on the receiving end of microaggressions. And what we know, again, with talking about intersectionality, is that there are certain groups who are more likely to experience this experience on a regular basis. I had a student once who described microaggressions as you're walking down the street and there's someone stepping on the back of your shoe the entire way. And if you are not typically on the receiving end of these microaggressions, and it happens to you occasionally, that experience of someone occasionally stepping on the back of your shoe may feel very different from the person that regularly experiences someone stepping on the back of their shoe. And so we have these two situations and identities and perspectives and places that are consistently also interacting with each other. And so understanding our intentions and also owning our impacts are important when we are made aware that we are the person who possibly unintentionally engaged in a microaggression, and being open to having conversation and discussion is important on both ends. Natalie, I think you were gonna say something, or no?
No, but I'm not Natalie.
Oh, I'm sorry. I looked at Natalie. I was reading her name.
I mean, I have a lot to say, but in the interest of
apology.
I always have a lot to say. Thank you.
So let's talk about some different types of microaggressions, because I think, Matt Mitchell, this will get to your point too of what, how do we make sense of all of this too? So there are also different types of microaggressions too. So micro assaults are overt and conscious, explicit or subtle slights and insults expressed to marginalized groups. So these, I think that's pretty clear about what that is. And then micro insults are verbal and nonverbal communications that subtly convey rudeness and insensitivity and demean a person's racial heritage and a person's identity. So an experience of a micro insult could be, if there's a book called Whistling Vivaldi, where it was a student in this book who talked about his experience of walking through actually Hyde Park, and where he learned that if he was whistling classical music, that the people that he was encountering had a different reaction and response to him versus when he was walking down the street just as a quote unquote normal or typical Black male. And some of those responses included people walking on the other side of the street, pulling their belongings closer to them. Some of those things are micro insults because there's the perception that I have to switch to the other side or pull my bag a little bit closer because of the idea that this young Black male may do something. And that comes again from implicit bias. Implicit bias comes from what we learn from our society and what gets reinforced about our understanding or perceptions about different people. Then there's micro invalidations. So communication that subtly excludes, negates, or nullifies the thoughts, feelings, or experiential reality of a person of a marginalized group. And some of those are the comments when someone shares that, oh, that was harmful or hurtful to me, instead of accepting or hearing that they may hear, oh, they didn't mean it that way. You must have been mistaken. There's the possibility that you may not have understood. Thoughts or reactions from reading these ways that microaggressions can show up. So what do we do? And one of the ways, if you're on the end of, let's say someone said that, you know, what you said I experienced as a microaggression, I think some of the things that are important for us to think about and do, what's on the screen here is if you're on the receiving end. And what I'm talking about is if you're on the other end of a person has shared that you committed a microaggression. And so what's important is to acknowledge, offer an apology, commit to understanding what is it about what happened in that interaction that made that person experience that as a microaggression. Listening for the intention to hear and understand, and not moving into the space of micro invalidation of, you probably didn't understand what I was saying, or perhaps you heard it wrong, or anything that will serve to invalidate their experience. On the receiving end, some of the things that we can do if we're on the receiving end of microaggressions, which many of us have likely been on the receiving end of microaggressions, seeking support from peers, colleagues, friends to discharge the situation so that you're not holding on to the experience, recognizing your own value and potential by not letting anyone else set the standard for who you are as a person. So doing that internal work and build of understanding who you are, and then addressing the situation head on by discussing it and holding a conversation to talk about it. If both of these things are happening on both sides, that creates the space to move in a direction of building relationship, connection, and change in a positive direction. Any reactions or responses? Microaggressions, I'll reiterate, and Matt Rogers pointed this out, that it's a difficult area to navigate, and it's still important that we do. And having this heightened sense of awareness will be helpful to navigate that, because now we're more sensitive to it as a reality and sensitive to what we can do to navigate it. So the last bit of our session today is going to be focused on a racial equity lens. So we've gotten through our definitions. I'm going to move into talking about how to use a racial equity lens. So we're switching gears a little bit here. So an equity lens, just in general, is a process for analyzing and diagnosing impact of a policy and how it impacts underserved and marginalized individuals, groups, and then also how you identify and eliminate barriers. When we're talking about a racial equity lens, and in general, but also specific to the racial equity lens, that I'll talk a little bit more about the READY Committee and its use of racial equity lens. It is a set of questions that we ask ourselves throughout a decision-making process. So the lens interrupts the impacts of unintended consequences by taking into consideration the lived experiences and perspectives of racially diverse communities. A racial equity lens calls to action. I'm going to read through these. Call to action to systemic oppression and calls attention to systemic oppression and racial inequities. It's about taking responsibility for inequities that result from institutional structures. When we use a racial equity lens, we're critically assessing and reassessing our own practices, becoming change agents to advance equity, providing a common vocabulary and protocol for evaluating decisions, policies, processes, programs, and practice for racial equity, and then making decisions that result in more equitable outcomes across policies, processes, programs, and practices. I'm going to talk through the racial equity lens and how the READY Committee has been using a racial equity lens to review documents and in order to make recommendations to the board. So some of the questions, so again, if we talk about what a racial equity lens and the concept in terms of the work of the READY Committee, it is a set of questions that guide our thinking about how to disrupt inequality and make decisions that are more aligned with equitable outcomes. And we're talking about racial equity. So these are the questions that we're asking. Does the procedure, process, and decision impact a marginalized community? If it does, how? Is engagement of members of the community needed for additional input? And if so, what are the thresholds for community engagement? So an example might be that a document needs firsthand feedback, that it requires deeper discussion, the document and the implications have a significant impact on the community, that the committee and the board is having some difficulty with reaching a consensus, and then time will allow for engagement and involvement from the community. So that would mean, so it's not a decision that necessitates an immediate determination. And then the next question is, how should members be included? And that could include a survey, an invitation to a meeting, or a focus group. Any questions so far before I keep going and talking about some of the questions that the READY Committee is using when we talk about using a racial equity lens? Okay. Is there any discriminatory language? Is there a lack of clarity, this should say, in the language? So are there statements in this document, this policy, that procedure, that someone reading it may need further interpretation? So one example of that is using acronyms with no defined definition. So is RPD without saying what RPD is in this document? Is there gendered language? Is there the use of she, her, he, him that needs to be removed and revised? Is there language typically defined through a dominant cultural lens? So an example of that is the idea of someone exhibiting professional behavior or the concept of professionalism. These are concepts that need to be operationalized so that people are not making assumptions about what it means and to be a professional or what professionalism behaviorally means in the space that they're in. Any thoughts about this line of questioning and how it's used by the Ready Committee? And JC, I don't know if you want to share anything about the experience so far with using some of these questions to look at documents.
I mean, what I would like to say, and I really have been thinking about this a lot since the last meeting, is having it be so clear what it is that we're looking for, I think really empowers the committee to make sure that like, I genuinely feel like we actually know what we're supposed to be doing now, looking at the ordinances. Do I think that we're going to get it perfect the first time? No, right? Like we're going to have to do a little bit of work. But having these guidelines to look through it, as opposed to just looking at it and trying to figure out what's not right with them, it's more efficient. It's more right. Like it just makes everything work so much better. And it's been really helpful, and I think it's been really empowering to the committee to be able to get that work done.
Thank you for that. Okay. So we're going to move into a point of reflection. We have 6 minutes left of our session. So we've worked our way through the remainder of our definitions, and we're moving into thinking specifically about Ridgeville. And so now that we've seen this racial equity lens and the way that the Ready Committee is thinking about things that cross their pathway, I want us to think about, and again, this can be just your personal reflection. After you're done reflecting, you can feel free to verbally share. You can share in the chat, or you can keep it as your personal reflection. How do I view the relationship of the Ready Committee with the board? What are the strengths of this relationship? And how can the relationship be enhanced for the benefit of the community? So take a few moments to reflect on these questions. Take 1 more minute. Okay, so I will invite anyone who wants to share verbally to have the space and the time to share.
I'll share if I can give 1 or 2 word answers. How do I view the relationship of the Ready Committee with the board? I believe it's growing. What are the strengths of the relationship? We're all comfortable with each other. And how can the relationship be enhanced for the benefit of the community by exactly what we're doing? We're all learning more about what Ready does and equity is.
Thank you.
I would add kind of to points 2 and 3. I really appreciate the common definitions so that we're all using the same language. I think these trainings are so helpful to get us all on the same page and kind of have the language to be able to keep the conversation going.
Thank you for that. Okay. So we're coming to the end of our time. So take a moment just to revisit what you set as your initial intention and revisit without judgment and thinking, did I meet my intention? Did new intentions surface over the course of the session? You'll take a moment just to reflect and think back. And I do want to leave us today slightly different from how we ended our first, with a call to action. So after today's session, I want you to think about and filling these blanks. I am committed to starting, and fill in that blank for yourself. I am committed to stopping. Fill in that blank for yourself. And finally, I am committed to continuing to. Fill in that blank. Okay, I want to thank everyone for your participation, for your level of transparency, for your involvement, and for showing up. We have our final session next week. I'm going to turn it back over to JC for our closing to close us out. I'll stop sharing my screen.
I just want to thank you all again for your participation. Aisha, thank you so much. These sessions really have been fantastic and I think really spot on to what we need. Thank you all for being here, and see you all next week. Hopefully, maybe with some more people. All right, thank you. I will adjourn us. I mean, officially, there's no one here to vote us out, but thank you all so much. See you all next week.